Both cases are in connection to the 2013 disappearance of Heather Elvis.
First tonight, the family of Heather Elvis is speaking out after one of two people convicted in the kidnapping of Elvis wants a new trial. Sydney Moore was first found guilty of obstruction of justice in September 2017 before being found guilty on a kidnapping charge in a 2019 retrial.
On the evening of December 18, 2013, in Myrtle Inlet, South Carolina, 20-year-old Heather Elvis stopped communicating. Just a few hours earlier, she had been laughing on the phone with a friend, making plans for Christmas, and dreaming about the future. The next morning, her car was found at the deserted Peachtree Landing boat dock. Her phone was silent, and her wallet and documents were left in the car. There was no trace of Heather herself. Heather was bright, energetic, and dreamy. She worked at a local restaurant, moonlighted as a makeup artist, and dreamed of becoming a professional photographer. Her friends said she lived on the edge of her emotions. She could laugh until she cried, and a minute later philosophize about the meaning of life. Her eyes, large and lively, seemed to reflect an inner fire. On the evening of December 17th, she had dinner with a friend, shared news, and admitted that she was finally starting to live a new life. The previous few months had been difficult for her. Heather had gone through a breakup with a married man almost 20 years her senior. She had been trying for a long time to forget, to recover, to become herself again. And that evening, it seemed she had truly let go of the past. Around 10 p.m., she returned home, wrote messages to friends, and posted photos. Everything seemed like a normal day, but a couple of hours later, her phone recorded a strange call. The number belonged to the very man she was trying to break up with. After that, Heather gathered her keys, got in her car, and drove away. No one has seen her since. On the morning of December 19th, Heather's father, Terry Elvis, received a call. His daughter had not shown up for work and was not responding to messages. He immediately felt alarmed. Heather was always punctual, he later recalled. If she doesn't answer for 5 minutes, you start to worry. But here, the hours passed, and there was silence. The police initially assumed that she might have left voluntarily with someone, but her family knew that wasn't the case. Heather couldn't just disappear. Her phone was turned off around 3 a.m., and the last ping was recorded in the marina area. That's where they found her car, a green Dodge Intrepid, neatly parked with the doors locked from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle, but there were also no traces, no fingerprints, no footprints, no cameras nearby. The first few days seemed like an eternity. Posters with her face were hung on every corner. Posts appeared on social media. Find Heather. She must come home. Her parents begged anyone with information to contact the police. Heather's mother, Debbie, hardly slept during those days. I kept thinking she was out there somewhere, waiting for us to find her, she said later. Every phone call made my heart stop. But the longer the search went on, the clearer it became. This was not a runaway, not a random disappearance. Everything pointed to someone knowing where Heather had gone and someone doing everything in their power to prevent her from returning. The disappearance of a young girl with a loving heart turned into a story where everything was on the surface: jealousy, passion, secrets. But beneath that surface lay something much darker. Within a few weeks, Myrtle's Inlet became a town living by one phrase: where is Heather? And the longer the answer remained elusive, the more frightening the question became. Heather Elvis's last day, December 17, 2013, began like hundreds of others. She left the house in a good mood that morning. Ahead of her lay a day of work at the restaurant, the pre-New Year's bustle, conversations with colleagues about their holiday plans. She looked happy, even slightly excited, as if a new chapter in her life was finally beginning. The last few months had been difficult for Heather. Her affair with a married man named Sydney Moore had ended painfully. When everything came to light, his wife Tammy caused a real scandal. She called, wrote, and threatened. Heather had to change her phone number and leave town for a while. But by December, the storm seemed to have subsided. She started dating someone new, tried to regain her confidence, socialized with friends, and laughed a lot. That day, she came to work earlier than usual. Her colleagues recalled that Heather was joking, making plans, and talking about a date she was going on in a few days. After her shift, she met up with her friend Brianna, and they went to dinner at a nearby cafe. At the table, the girls laughed, discussed Christmas gifts, and took pictures, one of which would later become the last image of Heather alive.
Top story and developing this morning. A lawyer for Sydney and Tammy Moore says that he plans to file a federal lawsuit next month in the Heather Elvis case.
Around 10 p.m., Heather drove her friend home. From that moment on, her life began to count down by the minute. Phone records show that around 11 p.m., she received a message from her ex, Sydney. He wrote that he wanted to meet, that he missed her, that their story couldn't end like this. For Heather, this man was a contradiction, both painful and attractive at the same time. She knew that her relationship with him had destroyed her peace of mind, that his family hated her, but her heart still hadn't let go. And when he called half an hour later, she answered. The conversation lasted several minutes. Afterwards, she wrote to her friend. He called. He says he wants to see me. I don't know what to do. Closer to midnight, Heather returned home, parked her car, and went inside. Neighbors would later say they saw lights in the windows and heard footsteps, as if someone was walking around the house, talking on the phone. At 1:35 a.m., she received another call from Sydney. 20 minutes later, another one. The last call came at 3:41 a.m. After that, the phone went silent forever. Investigators would later reconstruct her route using surveillance cameras. At approximately 2:45 a.m., her car was traveling on the highway, leading to Peachtree Landing Boat Dock. The cameras recorded the car pulling up, the headlights turning off, and that was it. After that, darkness. No one knows for sure what happened between 3 and 4 a.m. Perhaps she went there to meet him, to talk, to put an end to it. Perhaps she thought she had everything under control. But according to investigators, she was not alone. In the morning, her colleagues began to worry. Heather didn't show up for work and wasn't answering her phone. At first, her parents thought their daughter had simply fallen asleep after their nighttime conversation. But by evening, their concern had turned to panic. Terry Elvis, her father, began calling her friends and driving around places where she might be. No one had seen her since she got into her car. By nightfall, he reported her missing to the police. A few hours later, a patrol found her car, the same green Dodge Intrepid, parked at the marina. Inside were her bag, phone, and documents. Everything was neat and tidy, as if she were planning to return. But she didn't return. Terry was one of the first to arrive at the scene. He later recalled, "I stood by the water and knew she was somewhere nearby. Maybe she was calling me in the darkness, but I couldn't hear her." These words would later be repeated by many parents who had experienced something similar. The search began immediately. Volunteers combed the shores, divers went underwater. The cold wind from the Atlantic cut through the skin, but no one left. People clung to hope, even though they already understood that something was irreparable. On the third day of the search, Heather's mother said a phrase that became symbolic of the entire tragedy. "I don't want to find her body, I want to find her alive." But the more time passed, the more obvious it became that Heather would not be coming home. The search for Heather Elvis began on the morning of December 19, 2013. By that point, the family had spent a sleepless night calling everyone who might have known her. The police got involved quickly. The case of a young woman whose car was parked at a deserted marina seemed too disturbing to be considered a simple disappearance. The place where the car was found was chilling. Peachtree Landing is a quiet, deserted place, surrounded by swamps and pine trees. The road there is narrow, winding through fog and wet lowlands. Even during the day, you feel cut off from the world there, and at night, it feels as if the darkness itself is watching from behind the trees. The car was parked straight, the headlights were off. There was a bag on the seat and a phone in the cup holder. The doors were locked from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle. It just felt like the person had simply vanished. The first thing the investigators did was check all the surveillance cameras in the vicinity. It turned out that at around 3:42 a.m. that night, a dark pickup truck had driven past the pier. The model and silhouette matched the car belonging to Sydney Moore, Heather's ex-boyfriend. This was the first real lead. The following days turned into an endless chain of searches. Volunteers walked along the shore, combed the woods, called out her name, set up tents and floodlights. The water was cold and murky, but divers dived again and again. Every stain on the ground, every piece of fabric was carefully examined. But Heather was not found. The family lived by the phone. Every time someone from the police called, her mother hoped to hear, "We found her." But more often than not, the answer was, "We are continuing the search." Her father never left the pier. Sometimes they say he just sat there all night, staring at the water, as if hoping his daughter would emerge from the fog. The police began to investigate Heather's personal connections. Her phone calls and messages over the past 24 hours showed that the last person she spoke to was Sydney. He claimed that he just called to see how she was and that there were no meetings. But cell tower data told a different story. His phone was also in the Peachtree Landing area that night. Investigators summoned Sydney and his wife Tammy for questioning. The couple arrived together. Both appeared calm but wary. When the police asked why their phone signals had been recorded near the site of Heather's disappearance, they replied that they had simply been driving around at night to talk. This explanation seemed strange, but there was no direct evidence. Meanwhile, friends, neighbors, and volunteers continued to gather at the Elvis's house. People brought food and water and helped with posters. The town was consumed by the case. Television stations came every day, and journalists filmed reports about the girl who disappeared in the swamps.
Failed to transfer his case back to Horry County, denied his motion for a directed verdict on the charges, and allowed an expert in forensic video analysis to testify about Moore's truck.
In January 2014, after nearly a month of searching, investigators officially declared the Heather Elvis case a presumed murder investigation. The body was still missing, but the evidence was mounting. Threatening messages to Heather were found on Tammy Moore's phone. In one of them, she wrote, "You destroyed my family. I hope you remember what happens to those who steal other people's husbands." These messages, as well as data on the movements of the Moores' phones on the night of the disappearance, formed the basis for their arrest warrant. On February 21, 2014, Sydney and Tammy were detained. When news of the arrest spread throughout the city, people stood in the streets in silence. No one was happy. There was only a feeling of heaviness. On the one hand, justice had finally begun to take effect. On the other hand, Heather's body had not been found, and without a body, there was no final conclusion. The police continued their search. Excavators combed the swamps. Dogs searched for clues by scent. But all they found were traces, hints, fragments. Heather seemed to have disappeared without a trace, as if nature itself had decided to hide her secret. For the Elvis family, it was years of torture. Her mother said, "We can't bury our child. We can't even say she's gone. We live between hope and fear." This disappearance became one of South Carolina's most mysterious stories, a crime without a body, without an obvious motive, but with obvious pain that tore the hearts of those who knew Heather. After the arrest of Sydney and Tammy Moore in February 2014, the investigation into Heather Elvis's case became the main event in South Carolina. The small town of Murray's Inlet, where life usually flowed quietly, was now living under the glare of cameras, and residents discussed only one thing: how two adults, a family with children, could be involved in the disappearance of a 20-year-old girl. Investigators immediately realized that this was a difficult case. There was no body, no direct witnesses, only a chain of circumstantial evidence that had to be woven into a single fabric. And each piece of evidence led to the Moores. The first thing the experts confirmed was the calls and messages between Heather and Sydney on the night of her disappearance. Sydney tried to hide his contact with her. He called her from a payphone so as not to leave a trace on his phone. After that, she left home. According to telecom operators, both Moores' phones, his and his wife's, were in the Peachtree Landing Marina area on the same night, at the same time that Heather's phone signal was recorded there. During questioning, Sydney initially denied everything. He said that he had not met with her, that he just wanted to apologize for the past. But when investigators showed him printouts of calls and records from the gas station where he had used a payphone, his story began to unravel. He then became confused in his testimony, while Tammy, on the contrary, took more and more initiative. Dozens of messages addressed to Heather were found on Tammy's phone, containing threats and insults. One of them read, "You're just a mistake that will soon be corrected." Another read, "Stay away from my husband, or I'll make you disappear." The police searched the Murov home. There they found duct tape, plastic zip ties, and photos from social media in which Tammy posed with a gun, and captions such as, "Don't go where you're not wanted." Experts did not find Heather's DNA, but every detail added weight to the prosecution's case. Motive, aggression, opportunity to commit the crime. The key piece of evidence was a video from a highway camera showing their pickup truck heading toward Peachtree Landing at 3:36 a.m. Almost the same time, Heather's phone stopped responding. 40 minutes later, the same car returned. Investigators believe that Sydney had lured the girl to a meeting that night under the pretext of a farewell conversation. Tammy went with him to make sure it was over. A conflict arose between them and Heather, which ended in her death. No one knew exactly what happened, but all the evidence pointed to the fact that she never left the marina. The public followed every step of the case. The Driaf Find Heather Elvis movement appeared on social media. People held rallies, brought photos, and wrote letters to the court asking them not to forget Heather. In 2016, Sydney Moore was found guilty of kidnapping Heather Elvis. The trial was long and emotional. Heather's family, her parents, brothers, and friends sat in the courtroom. They listened as prosecutors described every detail and as defense attorneys tried to portray everything as a misunderstanding. But the facts spoke for themselves: deception, manipulation, lies. 2 years later, a separate trial was held for Tammy Moore. She was found guilty of kidnapping and conspiracy to commit murder. At the sentencing, she acted defiantly, smiling and looking directly at Heather's parents. The judge called her a woman driven by hatred and jealousy, brought to the point of obsession. Despite the convictions, Heather's body was never found. This was an unbearable reality for the family. They had achieved justice, but were unable to bury their daughter. After the trial, her mother said, "I don't know where she is, but I know she was killed by people who couldn't forgive her for simply loving." The Murr trial became an example of how a crime can be proven without a body, without witnesses, based solely on logic, technology, and human behavior. After the verdict, the prosecutor said, "We didn't find Heather, but we found the truth. And the truth is that these two destroyed her life because they couldn't accept her freedom." To understand why Heather Elvis disappeared, you have to understand who Sydney and Tammy Moore were. This couple epitomized the kind of family that seems normal on the outside, but is slowly falling apart on the inside due to jealousy, lies, and power struggles. Sydney Moore was almost 20 years older than Heather. He worked as a restaurant equipment repair technician and often visited the kitchens of establishments where he serviced equipment. It was there, at work, that he met Heather. She was young, smiling, lively. He was calm, friendly, with a soft southern accent. An attraction quickly developed between them. To her, he was a mature, confident man. To him, she became a symbol of youth and the attention he lacked in his marriage. But that wasn't the end of it. After Heather broke up with Sydney, Tammy didn't calm down. Her jealousy turned into obsession. She monitored the girl's social media pages, called her friends, and wrote comments under her photos. According to psychologists who studied her behavior, Tammy perceived Heather not as a person, but as a threat to her existence. Sydney found himself between two worlds, his young lover and his domineering wife. He did not have a strong character, and as the investigation showed, obeyed Tammy in almost everything. In court, prosecutors described him as a man willing to do anything to restore peace in his home. That is why he agreed to meet with Heather when Tammy demanded to close the issue forever. In their correspondence, which was reconstructed by experts, there were words that became key to understanding the motive. Sydney wrote to his wife, "I'll meet with her, talk to her, it will all be over." And Tammy replied, "Okay, make sure she disappears from our lives." When psychologists later analyzed the couple's behavior, they concluded that the crime was not born of a sudden impulse, but of a combination of jealousy and a need for control. Tammy could not allow another woman to exist in their world, and Sydney could not resist her. Together, they became a single mechanism of destruction. In court, Tammy acted defiantly. She smiled, argued with prosecutors, and sometimes laughed. She said that Heather destroyed her own life and that she wasn't going to apologize. Her face became a symbol of ruthless jealousy, cold, deliberate, cruel. The judge called her a person who wanted not just to destroy her rival, but to erase her from the world's memory. Sydney, on the other hand, looked lost. He hardly looked up and answered in monosyllables, but his silence spoke louder than words. When prosecutors read messages from his phone, he lowered his head and, according to witnesses, clenched his fists. Perhaps at that moment he realized that the line between submission and complicity had long since been blurred. The motive for the crime can be summed up in one word: power. Tammy wanted to regain control over her husband and her life. Sydney wanted to regain control over himself, to prove that he was capable of correcting his mistake. And the only way they found to do that was to get rid of the person who reminded them of their weakness. At the end of the trial, the prosecutor said, "They didn't just kill Heather, they destroyed her existence so that no one could remind them of who they had become." Heather's mother later confessed, "I saw not monsters in their faces, but emptiness. That's the scariest thing, to realize that the people who killed my daughter were people who simply couldn't bear the truth about themselves." This story showed that evil is often born not out of rage, but out of fear. Fear of losing power, love, control. And that the most frightening jealousy is not the kind that screams, but the kind that smiles and waits in the dark. The Heather Elvis trial lasted for many years. The first charges were brought in 2014, but the final verdicts were not handed down until almost a decade later. All this time, the Elvis family lived between hope and expectation of justice. Without their daughter's body, without a farewell, but with the certainty that the truth must be spoken aloud. Sidney Moore was found guilty of kidnapping Heather Elvis and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His wife, Tammy Moore, received the same sentence. The judge, announcing the decision, said, "You both destroyed a young woman's life to save your own lives, and now you will live with those lies for the rest of your lives." These words sounded like the final word in the courtroom, but for the Elvis family, it was not the end. Heather's father later told reporters, "There's nothing harder than living without knowing where your child is. The sentence is not the end, it's just a sign that the world has heard her name." The prosecution called this case a rare example of justice without a body. The entire case was based on digital traces, behavior, correspondence, and the logic of events. Investigators, prosecutors, volunteers, all of them worked on the case for years until they proved that Heather was the victim of a cold-blooded conspiracy. Heather's parents held hands. Her mother cried, her father just looked at the judge and nodded. After the hearing, they came out to the journalists, but instead of accusations, they said quietly, "We thank everyone who did not allow our daughter to be forgotten. Heather is not just a case, she was a person, and we want her to be remembered that way." Since then, December 18th, the day she disappeared, has become a day of remembrance in the town of Myrtle Inlet. Every year at Peachtree Landing, candles are lit, white flowers are brought, and ribbons with the words, "For Heather," are tied to the railing. People come with their families, remain silent, and look at the water. This story has become a symbol for South Carolina of how thin the line is between passion and destruction. What appeared to be a normal love story turned into a tragedy, where jealousy and fear of losing control proved stronger than human compassion. Psychologists who analyzed the case noted that there is no mystery here, only a warning. Tammy and Sidney Moore became an example of how relationships built on lies can escalate into violence. Their actions were not a flash in the pan, but the logical conclusion of a destroyed inner life. For the Elvis family, the worst thing is still not knowing. Heather's body was never found. Every year, her dad goes back to the pier where her car was found. He says, "I know she's somewhere around here. I can feel it. And as long as I'm alive, I'll keep looking." Heather's mother has set up a foundation to help families of missing persons. Their goal is to support those who live in the same hell of uncertainty. They call it fighting for the voice of those who can no longer speak. Heather Elvis's story is not just a chronicle of a crime. It is a story about love that became a weapon, about jealousy that turned into obsession, and about people who, despite everything, continue to believe in goodness. She was our sunshine, her mother said. And even if we can't see her light, we know it's still there somewhere, just through the fog. These words became the epigraph on a memorial plaque installed by the water. Everyone who reads them sees the reflection of candles in the river, and perhaps understands that evil does not ultimately prevail, as long as the victim is remembered by name.